Great games in the morning. This is Jonathan Albin, and this is Game Master Soapbox, and we have a full docket tonight. And I have to say that the rants are going wild. I've got a lot to talk about, so we're going to just jump right in, shall we? We're going to talk about the first thing is that consistent versus boring, which is which, and what is your experience in role playing? My experience as a storyteller has been such that I absolutely love to tell a story that happens every week. Every session, we have another part of the tale that continues, and it is a rather long experience. The players have noted that it is about a 7-year arc, which means we're playing every week for 7 years before we come to the final conclusion of the story arc before we start over again. And the question becomes, well, if you run every week, are you being consistent or are you being boring? And sometimes you're both or you're either. And what I mean by that is every one of us will run a session or two in a row where we just phone it in. In other words, we have done the work to develop the story, the NPCs, the situations. But instead of creating innovative ways to challenge the players, to engage them in the merits of role playing, instead we depend on them to fall into particular tropes and engagements and act out a certain way so that we don't have to do any work. We can just leave the pieces in place and the players will just grind forward. And the challenge with that is that you lead to a feeling of dissatisfaction, because even on your most clever days, if you are phoning in your performance as a game master, your players are going to see it. Either the NPCs are going to be lackluster, the conversations are going to fall flat, the information's not going to seem true. There's all kinds of reasons for it. So you have to realize there's a narrow line between being absolutely consistent, which means having a great session every single week, and becoming a boring exercise. And in today's world, players are not standing for it like they have in the past. It used to be if you were the storyteller, the game master for a region, and you had 12 or 14 players at your house, they were going to be there every week no matter what. And so you could, for a short period of time, kind of go on autopilot. But the world isn't that way anymore, especially if you are a paid game master. You cannot afford to run your session in a way that is seen as lackluster or not fully giving your all. So realize that you need to draw that line and make sure that you are staying on the correct side of that so that your campaign consistency isn't being confused with boring nature. So I'm going to get off that soapbox and on to my next one. Now we're going to talk about schedule changes. Now, every life has changed. Every person has occasions where things don't go as scheduled. Every session you play is not going to be attended by every player absolutely consistently. There's going to be things that fall apart. So how do you handle a temporary schedule change? Well, obviously, if it's a week change and everyone's going to be involved, then just simply holding off the encounter and leaving the timing sequences all the same and simply improving your refresher at the beginning of the next session to make sure that they are all back up onto the speed is fine. But most often you'll have one player or maybe a couple of players who cannot make a session, and therefore what do you do with them? Well, in NycosRPG we have a mechanism that guarantees that the players, when they are not at the game table, are still represented, because the persona that they are playing still are in the presence of the rest of the group. So the character is there even if the player is not. And though the player doesn't get to have responses and doesn't get engaged and doesn't earn any of the benefits of being a player in the session, nonetheless they are still there sharing the burden and such with the group. And therefore it's easier. In which case what happens is the player just simply misses out on any advancement that would have occurred in that week, and they are given a full debrief or rebrief when they come back into the session the next time. So the easiest way to handle it is to write the NPC out of the scene. I write the PC out of the scene for a reason, whether it be they got sick and couldn't make it to the rendezvous point, or they stayed in town or were detained or whatever. The, the that will lead, however, to having to rebalance your encounters to accommodate for their lack in the session in order to make it have a parity in the session, so there's no hard feelings or whatever. And then in the worst case, if it's going to be a majority of the players, it's sometimes better just to go ahead and wave off and reschedule a week later, thereby not putting yourself in a bind that way. So handling there's really not a rant in that one, so that one kind of slips through. But then next one is, how do you end a campaign? And this one's kind of sketchy because players want to come to a conclusion for their story at some point. And in certain cases, that might be, on their deathbeds. And there are times when you as a game master have finished the story that you wanted to tell. You got to the conclusion that you expected, and you just would like to have the story complete. So how do you end a campaign? Well, the first thing that is required is to have a conversation with all of the players. Don't try to piecemeal this. Don't try to speak with one or two at a time. Have a meeting, have a discussion, and say, guys, this story is at its conclusion. I'm done telling this story, and the characters are released, depending on how you do it, whether they're released to go play in other campaigns or if they are retiring and becoming NPCs within the realm or whatever. But just, you've got to clarify that and actually determine a satisfactory situation for each player. Some of them want to move on to other campaigns or engage in another story that you're telling within the realm of your adventures. And that's possible, perhaps. If it isn't, then it needs to be clarified so that there's no confusion. You need to perhaps have a session, a negative one, a session that is the session after the sessions, so that there is a moment for what's known as denouement, the idea that the characters have reached their own conclusions, their own story arcs are finalized. Maybe there's some leftover details that a player feels that should have been included. You certainly have to handle those. But mainly, the issue is that you and the players have to come to a consensus about when it occurs, what details entail that final condition before the game's over, and then a realization that it won't be won't be re-entered until it's an agreed to sequel or whatever, which is always, of course, a possibility. But just realize that your story can still have its conclusion, even if you're going to add on more story after. Just clarify when that one closes out so that everyone can be aware and retool and reset up. So, on the other hand, if all of your players give up on you and quit, then you already know how an end campaign ends, and so that's never a fun version. But sometimes you need to almost have the debrief yourself to reconcile where it ended and how it was completed or concluded, or what pieces may need to be left over so that you can run some perhaps one-shot adventures to fill in those gaps. But all right, that handles the ending of a campaign. So the next one, a total party kill, a TPK, a one-size-fits-all annihilation, a demolition of every man or woman or child or sort of whatever, is a horrible feeling. It's a horrible situation to be a participant in. And though I've been game mastering close on to 50 years, the number of TPKs I can fortunately still count on one hand, and not one of them was ever fun. There was only one of them that I would say was truly intentional on my part, but there was so much going on in the world that it just really was the best alternative given the variables. If I shared them with you, you'd see it too. But how to avoid a TPK is a little bit more retrospective. You have to be able to see it coming. You have to be able to read the tea leaves, so to speak, with what the players are doing, and note that the situation is going to be dire in order to be able to avoid it. And sometimes it's less useful to avoid than it is to allow to happen, simply because there's enough angst on the part of the players that there's nothing that you or any other person could do to prevent the implosion. So sometimes the TPK, there's no avoidance, excuse me, there's no avoidance other than to circumvent and therefore have some other reason for the story to end in advance. And maybe the end of a campaign is a way to avoid a TPK if it's coming, if it's the end of an age and the players made a mistake and they're not going to be able to stop the BBG before he reaches some objective. Maybe it is better for the players to return to their homelands and run their own private stories of their survival of the coming dark ages rather than finalize and have them obliterated. But the main way to avoid a TPK is to allow at least one of the players some form of survival. Doesn't matter whether it means that they are not outright killed, or they are assumed dead, or they are revived by an ally. Leave some way for at least one of the players to be able to tell the tale of what had happened to the others, so that there is at least a sense or a form of the cautionary tale that can come from it. And I have to say, man, the second one today, that there is at least one campaign that I ran that when it ended in a near TPK, the players actually said they were relieved that it had gotten to that point, because they had individually all feared the situation because one of the players had declared themselves a turncoat. They all had felt it coming at some point, but they were so weary of waiting for it that it was a burden. And so the actual conflict that led to the near TPK was actually something that they appreciated and were glad to have engaged. So if your purpose is to avoid it at all costs, make sure you give at least some form of an out that does at least assuage whatever frustrations led into the TPK, even if it was just simply, I want to do something stupid, and whatever, you have to find a way to let that happen. So the next point, should villains ever monologue? Yes. Yes. In almost all situations, you want your villains to monologue. There are a bunch of reasons. The first one is that it is a trope that is nearly always expected of a villain. And while every villain doesn't necessarily have to wax poetic about it, they should reveal their intent in some way so that the players have the opportunity to interact with it. There was a video some years ago that was the 100 things that a supervillain should do to succeed. And it was basically a recounting of all the things that happened in Bond movies that were the reveals and took away the surprise of the villain, and how those things would have resulted in a villain's success if they hadn't been handled the way they were. But I posit to you that a villain's handbook should be read in reverse, and that everything that is in there should happen. And that, of course, leads to my next point, and that is, what is it that every big, bad, evil guy ever should do to be memorable? Is to do things that can be remembered, and that is put him out in front of the players and do something stupid. Put his minions out in such a way that they can be mowed down round after round gleefully for 2 or 3 rounds in a fight. Maybe have them all miss for a couple of turns. Whether you intentionally do so or just set the threshold so high they have no choice. The point here is that the big bads, if you want them to be remembered, they have to be big bads that are recognized as such. And the only way to do that is to take the very things that would define the big bad and make sure that you're over the top on it. This will give the big bads the reputation, the expectation, and the anticipation will all be resolved in a positive light, and your villains will be remembered. Now, next one's going to be, again, sketchy. You're going to have some people that are going to love me, hate me on this one. And if you see in anything in these this next part about the railroads that you disagree with, make sure you leave me a comment or put a post in the chat. I'm on Twitch right now, and I'll be on here finishing this broadcast. So if you've got something you'd like to say about any of these points, feel free to do so. I'll respond to them immediately. So the question is, what are the 3 reasons to create railroad situations? The first one is if the players miss too many of your hints. We game masters sometimes think we're particularly clever, and we want players to go to a certain place and do a certain thing, and so we make veiled, and sometimes not so veiled, hints about what they should be doing. We introduce them to an NPC who describes to them what's going on. Then they run into a location where the signs are that the big bads who are doing these things have gone to that same place. And there's like 3 or 4 evidentiary positions that we make, and then the players have not responded to it. It's time for a railroad, because not a full railroad, mind you, but just a railroad station stop or 2 that will put them back on track. Now, those of you that are not campaign oriented and do not like the idea of a long-term story, please respond and give me hell for that, because I will explain in response why it's important and useful to do so, because there's more at stake than what you may think. The primary reason is that many times such changes are geographic, and therefore the players need to move to another location for the next piece to become evident. So having the players get on board your railroad, so to speak, and follow the directions that you've advised, or join the caravan that's making its way to the place, or whatever mechanism you want, that will facilitate you continuing to tell the story as you intended. Now, a full-on railroad means that they can't get off that railroad. And a full-on railroad means that even once they get there, they have to do the things that you have intended. I'm not saying to do any of that. All I'm saying is that on occasion, a player will overstep a line or miss a cue and not get what you were laying down, and therefore deprive them of a piece of the story you wanted to make sure they got to experience. So just realize that a railroad is one way to get them back on course. A second time to railroad is that if the players have put themselves in a situation that makes it untenable for them to succeed without additional modifiers, benefits, NPC assistance, or something. And so therefore you're literally saving the group from themselves, because often the players don't see the danger and don't understand the dangers. And so by using a railroad mechanism, you're going here instead of there kind of situation, you afford them the opportunity to run into the resources that you need for them to have discovered. So that's a second of the 3 reasons. And the third reason to create a railroad situation is simply so that the players who are attempting to live in a sandbox even know what the difference is, because quite often when you give descriptions and clues to a group that are avowed sandboxers, they'll refuse to respond. They'll refuse to react, because they think that what you're doing with your narrative descriptions and veiled and unveiled hints at what they might do are intentionally trying to railroad them. And so therefore they will balk and respond negatively to the storyline. And by giving them an actual chunk of railroad to have experienced and understand, that gives them the opportunity to be more aware of the truly free options that you're providing them. And with those three in mind, the concept of whether a sandbox wins over a railroad um, isn't decided, but it certainly is perhaps for a little while averted, shall we say. Alrighty. So the next section we're going to talk about is when the meta isn't good for the players. And this isn't what you may be thinking. A player who loves to read up on what the latest activity is in the role-playing world and the latest recommendations of character profile builds and stuff. The reason why the meta can be not good for them is that it deprives them the opportunity to actually make choice and make reasoned decisions about things. I guess you'd say the impetus for a player to follow what he's reading in non-session lore, the overall world of gaming and dungeon mastery, is they're wanting to give themselves additional knowledge. Well, the best teacher of knowledge is experience, and so it's far better for a player to understand the reason why he'd want to pick up an extra level in Bard before he changes class is perhaps more easily taught by having them play through it than having someone read a book and tell them that it's a better choice. So the real thing about the meta being bad for a player is that sometimes the advice is on the merits of what makes a storyline expedite or to improve the standing of the player in a culture or whatever, and those aren't always things that every player wants to pursue. So just be aware that sometimes the meta isn't good for the players, and so whenever a player is going to employ some pattern of activity that is defended by their meta, just make sure that they're met with a fair and equitable amount of crosstalk so that they can really be sure that the choice they're making is the one they want. This next one is my biggest rant for the day, and it is against the concept that a person who is home-brewing Dungeons and Dragons or home-brewing role-playing games is somehow damaging the hobby. And I want to explain, I want to define why homebrew will always be the successful and best form of role-playing. You see, the reality is that a game master's resources include all of the printed materials and then some, right? They might be reading novels and other fiction and maybe some historical fact books that give them new arsenals of information to play with within the campaign. And when they are held or limited to their game groups advances by canon, they are not only held down and held back from creative interpretation, they are actually limited into a form of servitude in terms of their game mastery skills. Because when you are following the lore, you must use the product and properties of the dungeon master, the game producer. And when you do that, you therefore subject yourself to their full brunt and force of their IP license. And so the irony is that the more creative you are as a game master and the farther you walk afield, the safer you are within the environment to tell your story. Whereas the closer you work in line with the currently published materials, the less safe you are from oversight, because if you are playing and administering under only their just jurisdiction, then there is no reason why they couldn't also set limits on or restrict your capacity to participate. So the the homebrew will always win out because it will always give you the opportunity for new insight, new innovation, to experience role play in ways that you haven't before, and those are all positive things. So my parting comment for tonight's episode is a quote I read someplace a long time ago, and that is that real life is for those who can't handle good role-playing encounters. If your game sessions are more real to you than real life, then welcome to Nikos. If you have not picked up a dice without considering what the armor class 0 number might be, or what armor class you might exceed on a certain roll, then you are also a member of Nikos. So just realize that the real life is just something we experience. I've got a very good friend and a colleague who says that in her life she existed only here on Earth, but she lives in Nikos. So have a great day, and if you like what you've seen, make sure you subscribe so you get notification every time we do a new video, and of course click the like because that'll help us get this episode out to more people. Thank you again for your time. And if you are watching this on Twitch, do remember that Saturdays we do a game session specifically for Twitch viewers, wherein you from the viewer's seat get the opportunity to play a character in an ongoing Nikos campaign. And that is Saturday at 10 a.m. I'm sorry, now Saturday at 9 a.m. We run until about 11, sometimes a little bit longer depending on the players. And we are involved in a story that is part of the 9th iteration arc. So you are gaining a piece of what the world of Nikos is like. And as an added benefit, again for this week, I've got an ability to extend my offer. And that is anybody that plays during the session and plays throughout till the end of end of the episode gets a absolutely free copy of the PDF of the Nikos Dark Shards system book. So make sure you look for that and watch for us. And I will see you on the next episode. This is Jonathan Albin, and this is NycosRPG.